Morning, Barbara.
Good morning, Raymond. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine.
How's Toronto?
Um, Gray and damp at the moment, but
We just have a lot of ice here. So, well, so thank you for joining me
mhm.
here. Um, Thinking about music and watching music is something that I've been puzzling over for a long time,
Mhm.
and a lot of thinking and engagement with that process has been going on for the past few years, in particular, due to COVID.
Mhm.
But I thought maybe I sent I sent some ideas for things we can
Yep,
discuss. And
sure.
being somebody interested in history and thinking we learn from history and we can reflect on behavior by looking at history, that I thought maybe we could start with where this all started, this watching music.
Well, I mean, I think watching music has probably been around forever. Since people started making music, I mean, um, there have been people presumably listening and watching, as far back as you want to go. Um, Even in a form as community inclusive as a gamelan, for example, there are still, I think, people watching, a lot of people playing, but people watching. I think the desire to watch music is pretty universal. Um, if you're walking down the street and you hear you know, some nice music, I think it's almost natural to try to figure out where it's coming from. That could be walking by a bar, that could be walking by a concert, that could be, walking by a store that sells computers and TVs. It doesn't
Right.
much matter. Um,
So
you
what
know,
did, sorry, go ahead.
if you go to the time of, say, Mozart or Haydn, or Bach, music was watched in specific settings, at least the music that we refer to as classical music, but there was a secular music as well. Um, and Haydn's music would have been for many years watched most often by people related with the Esterhazy Palace. Um,
Music created an opportunity for people to come together to share it.
right. Or in the case of one of the princes of Esterhazy, who was actually a very good baritone player. Um, I think the love of music was quite genuine, and Haydn wrote a lot of music for him too. But um, yes, it was an opportunity to come together, and it's an opportunity to come together with a kind of shared intent. And I'm not sure that this was, I think that's kind of uncommon, because if you think about it, what other situations do you go to? And thinking especially of a classical music concert, what other thing do you go to where everybody sits silently partaking of the same thing? It's
Religious,
a religious
sacred,
service, perhaps. Um, so
or a
I,
scholarly, a lecture or presentation.
yeah, perhaps, but I'm not sure that's the same kind of emotional experience.
Right.
Certainly an intellectual experience, but having that kind of common emotional experience as listening to a concert, that's kind of an unusual situation. I think especially today where people are listening and watching through electronic media, their actual involvement is almost completely isolated. They may be part of a large group of people watching, but that's not the same thing.
Well, then there's also the question not just of sharing it, but of literally watching it, of watching the way the instrument produces the sound, to watching the way the singer's body engages with making the sound, or
Right.
it's like lip reading. The experience, the understanding of what's being said is somehow intensified both by watching the lips make the words, but also the expression on the face. I mean, the same words can be used in different with different meanings, and the
Right.
facial gesture, facial expression can give a
Well,
different understanding.
even if you look at, I mean, if I, talking to some of my colleagues who grew up listening to, for example, rock music and going to a lot of those big stadium concerts, none of them will tell you that watching online is a substitute for going to one of those concerts.
Right.
It just isn't. On
Right.
the other hand, going to hear Mahler's Eighth Symphony live, watching online is not a substitute. It can't be.
Right. So, so what did what did the 20th century experience of listening to music without any visual engagement, with the recording arts being totally focused on audio, what did that do with our understanding of music, or to the way we relate to musical life?
Um, Boy, that's a great question. I think it did a couple of things. Um, it made it a much more uh, it made it much more transportable, for one thing.
Yes.
Without the recording arts, you couldn't have had radio, you couldn't have had television, you couldn't have had any of these things that actually have allowed music of whatever kind to reach enormous numbers of people. And that's as true of classical music as it is for Bob Dylan or the Beach Boys. Doesn't much matter. Without the recording arts, you know, what happened with them could not have happened. And, you know, people outside of the places where concerts were happening would not have had access. Period. Um, except for traveling musicians.
It's very important for the spread, for the understanding,
Absolutely. And
repertoire.
in today's digital world, you know, a much broader range of music is reaching a much broader range of people than would have even been thought possible 50 years ago,
Let alone 150 years ago.
let alone 150 years ago.
There's absolutely no,
But
yeah,
but the the listening without seeing um, can seem like a much more intellectual experience, I think. Um, I th I think being able to see a concert is a potentially a vastly more interesting experience. Though, a lot of my colleagues and people that review classical music would probably disagree vehemently. Um, I still don't think there's a substitute. I mean, for example, I love the Beethoven string quartets, and I have listened to all of them many times. But I've also seen a number of different quartets do complete cycles, all the Beethoven string quartets, because I'm a nut for it.
yeah.
And None of the recordings are actually a substitute for watching all of those pieces being played live. Um, Now with good camera work and all of that, you can I would say with a really good uh, camera team, you can create something really interesting. But I think we have to not think of it as a substitute or a replacement for anything. It is something different because the needs of that media are different from an audience in sitting in a concert hall. And I would also say that, in the late 19th century or whatever, classical music came up with about the least engaging way of presenting music known to humanity,
Which was.
which was, here's a big room, go sit in it, don't move, don't make a noise. If the music makes you want to dance, don't do it. Don't stand up, don't cheer, don't clap. You know, it's, I mean, good heavens, if you go to a good, evening of folk music or jazz or a rock concert, it's just full of people engaged in their own way with the music. And um, I saw a really great concert with Tafelmusik in Toronto, in which they decided to, you know, have a concert more in the way that would have happened in Mozart's time. But they said a couple of things. First of all, one of his piano concertos being played, I think it was Michael Levin, fantastic. But they said, listen, we want you to just, if you like the oboe solo, clap, cheer. If you like something, whatever, but react. And it was like a collective, first of all, kind of, you really want us to do that? But then people got into it, and it was like a collective sigh of relief. Well, thank heavens we can react to the music. So that's what I mean. Somewhere along the way, um, classical music invented a really austere, uninviting way of listening to music, unless you were one of the in folks.
When I was a child, my father would push all the furniture back so there would be a big open space in the living room, and he'd put on music, literally anything from Handel or Bach to Dvorak to Stravinsky to Frank Zappa, and he'd say, "Dance," and I would dance. And my knowledge of music, my connection to music very much stems from that engagement with the music. And he would always say, "Don't just dance, listen to the music, listen." And so I connected to music in a very visceral way as a child. And when I went to Lincoln Center to go to the young people's concerts that Leonard Bernstein had, I thought, why are we all sitting here? Shouldn't we just be able to dance? So I know exactly what you're saying, Raymond. I
Your
mean,
father was a very enlightened person. I know he was, but this is just additional proof that he
right? Yeah.
he he really understood something very essential about music.
Yes.
Music and reaction, emotional reaction and movement are all intertwined. So, you know, and when you get to electronic media, you know, live streams, I mean, there's a lot of neat stuff, live stuff, concert stuff on the web. But those things that try to recreate the ambience of the austere concert hall are, at least for me personally, insufferably boring.
Right.
And partly because, go back to what I said previously, it's a different media. It has to be treated differently rather than simply a platform to recreate that, a very specialized and austere experience.
There are people in absolutely, and you can almost feel the sound engineers trying to capture the sound of the air molecules between the notes, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's that purifying, or
yeah,
for better or worse. Um, I I wanted to just comment on cartoons because I've seen a lot of references from people, particularly people who grew up in the 50s, um, who had television. The first widespread use of television was available then, and cartoons used it was just animated images and a narration
mhm,
going on that was usually silent, and everything was carried in the music, and the music carried the drama, the sense of conflict, the sense of relief, everything, every emotion in the story that the cartoon was telling was
mhm.
revealed in the music. And people talk about their first experience of any kind of music, but particularly classical music, coming from cartoons. And I mean, that's a North American and perhaps European experience, but it was a very important connection between image and music that
Right.
took place in at least in North American culture early on. Um,
You're right. You're absolutely right. Um, if you think of going back, I mean, not only were they aware of sound and music, but if you think about it, there are a whole bunch of cartoonists, major cartoonists, who also knew a great deal about music. And you think of some of the Bugs Bunny cartoons that are very specifically about music, or Ben and Jerry, or no, Tom, not Ben and Jerry, Tom and Jerry.
right, Tom and
And
Jerry.
why am I wanting ice cream? Anyway, you know, there were a whole bunch of people and that referenced jazz, and that's in the old cartoons. That's even before Walt Disney's Fantasia, which is obviously was a movie where a lot of people kind of discovered different kinds of music. Um, but a friend of mine and I actually, for a short time, taught a course about, or it was kind of lectures about music and cartoons. And what we discovered was that all of our references meant absolutely nothing to college age kids. They were dated. They thought they were kind of funny, but there was no actual connection to them. However, if you talked about video games, which, by the way, some of them have great music and they have music written for them, um, you know, then it starts to click. So the cartoons is an interesting it's an interesting reference point. I suppose music and the way Miyazaki uses it would be a reference point for some people, and he uses music brilliantly. But but I think this is actually a really interesting point. The question of cultural reference points and when they become dated or go from being a current reference point to being something historical.
Mm,
I think
yes,
today's reference points are completely different. They probably have more to do with TikTok and but
reels.
if you look at TikTok and how often classical music is used in videos on TikTok, the music is still there, but the reference point is different.
And the relationship between the music and what you're watching, what you see, the
Yep.
visual, is sometimes arbitrary. I mean, it may not have any particular purpose, except
Well, but that's according to your definition or mine,
right.
you know, and it may not have any particular reference to any of the knowledge we have about the music, but in the mind of the person creating it, it's not arbitrary. It's what they want there for, and so the reference point, I guess, in some cases becomes the video, not the music.
Well, how did opera enter into this experience or this exploration of watching music happen? I mean, on stage, opera and ballet both are really all about watching and absorbing,
Mhm.
um, whether it's costume and color and sometimes lights. In the 20s, when we had the electrical
Yeah.
know-how, lighting a real factor in scenic experience. Um, but it's a narrative, and the story is told through characters.
Yes.
Abstract ballets like Balanchine's, some of Balanchine's works, Apollo, and so on. It this connection between the music and the watching is really um, essential for.
That's true. That's absolutely true. I think I mean, opera and ballet are almost by definition a more visual medium, at least, more immediately visual. Um, it is obvious that what's going on the stage is you know, where most of the action is. Whereas if you're watching an orchestra concert, once you get into it, there's lots to watch, but it's less obviously principally a visual experience. Um, I a couple of years ago, I mean, I'd heard of for example, the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, and I'd seen them on a video, and I thought, wow, they're really, really, really good. But a couple of years ago, I finally got a chance to see them live, and I saw the piece Revelations, and it blew me away. I mean, nothing in the world that I had seen on video prepared me for what I saw on stage. It was complex, it was fantastic, it was overwhelming, but it was just absolutely mesmerizing from beginning to end.
Energy, just pure energy,
It's the energy, it's the choreography.
story, a sense of
Um,
spirit and explosion.
absolutely. And watching it with an audience who were obviously equally enamored of what they were watching. That adds a great deal. So I think even with a really good video team, it didn't capture the full experience of watching this piece live. It just doesn't.
So the Metropolitan Opera, for instance, and other companies had been developing, and Metropolitan, often with members of Rhombus Media in the early days, they were recording, um, creating a kind of a new art form, which was the art of recording opera for watching.
Right.
And uh, and that became an important opportunity for that, as you called it, this widespread access, this democratization of access,
Mhm.
even ticket prices, or New York City denizens not able to see it all the time. But the that was a sort of a forerunner of something that happened starting in March of 2020. Um, but actually, a more important, perhaps, forerunner of that was what happened in pop music with with video trailers or just video clips,
Yep.
so that pop music stopped being just about singing a song and creating the good audio reproduction of the song and the lyrics, but it was also about something about a story or a narrative somehow coming across in a video, whether it was a love story or I'm happy, like a happy song, or
Mhm.
uh, um, I don't know, the pop music really, commercial music really brought us in
Yep.
another realm of watching music and sort of taking even very simple material and making it more than the sum of its parts, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for example, here where I am right now in Toronto, if you look at the commercial classical station here, CFMZ, you know, uh, which is doing some, I mean, they are really mainstream classical, um, unapologetically so, but they're also doing some really, really interesting video work. You know, their live performance space. They're doing things. Um, you know, I'm not sure if they're groundbreaking, but they're certainly starting to use a lot more of the possibility. It's no, I don't think it's any accident that this station started doing this and is developing all kinds of things now around classical music. Is owned and was developed by Moses Neimer, who
Mhm.
came out of City TV and Much Music.
Right.
He came out of the sensibility, and I'm, full credit to him. I mean, whether all of his programming is what you want, the fact that the engagement with different media, I don't think it's an accident that they're doing this. It's because the guy that owns the business came out of that background.
Yeah. So let's go back to March 2020.
Okay,
So,
do I have to?
well, as as an intellectual exercise
Okay, yeah.
to see what we can understand about what happened, not so much to everything in the world, but the impact it had on music. So, March 2020, depending on which part of the world you were in, things really started to close down, sometimes with a big fat slam.
Yep.
And there were no more theaters, there was no more sitting in a theater, there was no more sharing space with other people. Uh, there were um, artists suddenly grieving the engagements they were supposed to be having, performing live for audiences
Mhm.
in their town or somewhere else on the road, quickly returning home, um, and sheltering in place and just not having any idea what was to come.
Right.
And then what happened?
Well, and then artists, some other groups tried to figure out what next. Actually, they were trying to figure out what can we do now,
Right.
and and came up with, well, let's do concerts online. Let's do that kind of thing. And I think that all of those responses were terrific, but they were also a I think an attempt to provide comfort and continuity, reassurance by providing this wonderful music in a setting that a lot of people would know, a concert setting, minus the audience, but um, it was still, I mean, I think a lot of what went on from March of 2020 until, for the next year and a half, was about trying to provide comfort, continuity, reassurance for those watching, but also for the musicians, for both.
I mean, famously, Igor Levit did over 50 performances from his living room,
Right.
his iPhone or whatever phone he had, streaming 20 to 25 minutes of music an evening for people.
And that was fantastic. And I watched a bunch of those, and they were really, really, they were wonderful. They were needed. They provided him with a creative outlet, but they also provided a lot of people watching some sense of connection with a world that, they were hoping hadn't completely disappeared. And that is and the sheer amount of work on his part to do that is kind of amazing. I mean, doing a 25-minute concert every night, every single night.
With different,
It's astonishing. And that stands as a marvelous reaction to a very difficult time. But it's not the same thing as, it doesn't actually address the same question as, what do you do with the media to bring out its possibilities? And the possibilities, I think you have to figure out what the possibilities are. I think you have to start with looking at the media instead of transposing, current or past experience, especially concert experience, onto a new media. I think it's going to be something different. So, so well before the pandemic, I got invited to it was kind of a lab, a virtual reality lab, to look at what they were doing there. Won't name it, but it was a big deal, big company. And that I had they put me, I had the funny goggles on, the whole thing.
right.
And it was still something in its infancy, but one of them was me in some kind of crazy Harry Potter kind of room where, I had things on my hands, and I could paint, or I could go in certain directions or create something. But I was also in this crazy building where I could see through the floors and the walls. And so it was like I was in this 3D labyrinth. And fortunately, my guide, the person that was working there, was also an opera buff. And we ended up talking about, what would it be like if you put this technology in the hands of a great opera director and William Kentridge to design, literally design a playground or an opera in which the audience, wherever they are, could move freely among or around or with whatever is going on stage, or a corollary for an orchestra concert. What if you could actually sit beside the principal trumpet or sit in the percussion section? Well,
Yes, of course.
that would come close to, people ask me, because I used to play professionally in orchestra. They say, well, what was it like playing in the orchestra? And I can't describe it, not really. But if somebody could sit there in that position in the middle of the orchestra, I think for a lot of people, their first reaction would be, holy shit. I had no idea. And I was listening to this, and man, that piccolo is really loud, and that, and it's, we have the capacity, I think now, to create a vastly different concert experience that can be shared at a great distance. Just like we also have, I know pianist Miriam Conti, lived in New York for a long time now, is back in Buenos Aires. She's working very closely with Yamaha on the disc clavier.
Mm-hmm.
And they have figured out how she can teach people in different countries in real time. People have to have a disc clavier, but she's done this with multiple countries, and the students play, and what they're playing plays back to her in real time. This is also a revolution brought about by technology. And if you kind of imagine that capability outwards, it has the potential, to allow, people who are not in a major center to be as connected as anybody else.
That reminds me, about 15 years ago, or maybe it's a little more, the composer Christos Hatsis did a piece with the Nouvel Ensemble Moderne to inaugurate the atrium at the CBC building in Toronto, dedicated to Glenn Gould. And he used a disc clavier where he had studied and created the touch that Gould had on this disc clavier, this empty piano, which was being accompanied by the Nouvel Ensemble Moderne in this concert to inaugurate. And it, you were listening to music that Gould would never have seen. It was a completely new piece of music, but it his technique that was applied to a careful analysis of his touch
Right.
To these notes. It was quite remarkable.
And it points to, it points to a potential. I think a lot of these technological things have the potential to bring people together, but equally have the potential to separate people, which of course is one of the most, vis-a-vis social media, is one of the most important discussions in the world now. Social media can bring people together. It can also be a source of enormous hatred and division.
Because it seems almost unreal, the dynamic, right? So one of the things that happened during COVID was a lot of really bad videos being put together and put up in social media so that either artists could have an opportunity just to play and sometimes even get paid a little bit for it, or audiences could have a continuity. Sometimes venues would pick up live performance in an empty hall and broadcast it, make it available to their subscription audience who had no place to go but would sit at home on the couch and watch it on their TV screen or on their computer or their iPhone. So, this sense of continuity that you were describing before, the sense of opportunity for the artist. And along the way, there was a lot of stuff that you probably wouldn't want to preserve, but there were also some important connections made between video artists and performing artists. And those collaborations, I keep thinking of Balanchine sort of rediscovering Bach and creating incredible interpretations of Bach as a choreographer. I think we've found, in some cases, video artists who have discovered ways of interpreting and bringing music to life in ways which become really a new art form, and in some cases, musicians who understand a connection between what they are doing as performers or composers as well, and the visual presentation or interpretation of.
Well,
So
even the sense of collaboration,
yeah.
and there are some wonderful classical musicians who seem to instinctively understand this. One is Yo-Yo Ma, as well as anybody, and his, him collaborating with you name it, it is fantastic. I think
Rogers, right?
yep,
Yeah.
I think I think if we're looking, a little bit through the lens of classical music or opera, whatever, I think there's a lot that we need to learn. We meaning people in classical music, and this is not just the performers, composers, presenters, record companies, you name it, and they need to learn or watch closely what people in pop music, folk music, in rock, in jazz, in other art forms are doing, because they seem to collaborate much more easily. Now there is one group that is kind of an exception that is very much part of classical music, and that is percussionists. Percussionists and guitarists cross, they don't even, it's like, what barrier? What genre? What line? I don't
Right.
know anything. And and but I
Look,
think we
they
need to
all,
look further afield. But think about it. When 20 years ago, the concept of a classical musician talking to the audience, or 25 years ago, was like, no.
right.
And people were offended by that. I remember that. People will go, why is he talking? Well, look at what happens now. And people, a lot of uh there are a lot of classical musicians who do it naturally and do it really well now. And I think it's kind of essential, because otherwise it is kind of you're putting a distance. I mean, in what other
Right.
in what other situation would you walk on the stage and bow and never talk to anybody? Well, it would be the same situation where you're not allowed to dance. So I
Right.
rest my case.
Right. Yeah, there's that fourth wall dynamic of a classical concert, which
Yeah.
for some people can be reassuring because they can just sit and not feel intruded upon if they sit in the audience. But on the other hand, it's a huge loss because that possibility of deep engagement with it is, I think it ends up being behind the screen, as it were, but the
Yep.
actual exercise. And there's I mean, obviously for some people this is to be desired. For others it's really anathema, and often they don't return to the concert hall, um, because they just don't see the point of it. They want a visceral engagement in the way they experience music,
They
which,
also want a human engagement.
yeah,
And I think one of the challenges that classical music has is engagement, is bringing new people in. And I think talking to them is a fairly obviously essential ingredient.
right. And maybe understanding Bach isn't the most important thing about the musical experience. There's something else about the experience of music and that communication, which is the most important thing. And I must say, at the end of COVID, I didn't really care so much which notes I was hearing as that I cared that I felt the urgency of sharing the musical experience with the performer and with a group of people. And I found myself enjoying going to a small jazz club, even with all of its threats of microbial
Yeah.
engagement as well. But that was where I found myself feeling alive in a way that was really very important, as the restrictions were lifting.
Well, I think I think there's also we tend to in classical music think we should um, prescribe what people should feel, how they should react. I think this is lethal. You know, if somebody will sit down and listen to Mozart or Bach, great. It's up to them, entirely up to them, what they think or feel. And that's the way it should be, in my opinion. You know, before COVID, I remember going to Lincoln Center to hear the Cleveland Orchestra. They were playing a Bruckner symphony, and one of the movements is almost all pizzicato strings. And I took a friend of mine who had never been to, he was a great jazz buff, wasn't from New York, was a great jazz buff and knew a lot about jazz, but had never ever been to an orchestra concert. And so he wasn't so sure about Bruckner, and it was kind of a huge first step. The other thing on the program was John Adams. He kind of, yeah, I get that. But the thing he talked about most was the pizzicato movement. And he couldn't believe just the coordination and the sound. And I got emails from him like every hour for the next week about this concert, but especially about the kinds of sounds in the orchestra. I couldn't have told him, and I'm glad I didn't, what to listen for.
Right.
He was just completely blown away by what he heard.
Right. And Pitsy is kind of interesting. I heard a piece by Alvin Singleton last week at Chamber Music America. And for me, the most interesting and puzzling part of the piece was a Pitsy passage. It went
Yeah.
on for maybe a minute. And I kept thinking, I don't know what this piece is about, but that part sounds like it's a code, and I'm trying to figure out what he's telling us. So
Right.
it was like, SOS, dot, 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 dot. It wasn't, but it just felt, it had that sense of listen in, this is important.
But I think, the essential point for me is those of us involved in classical music in whatever way, we need to stop telling people how they should listen to it, how they should enjoy it, how they should approach it. If we want to talk, I mean, this is, having a performer stand up and say, this is why I'm playing this. This is why I like this.
Yeah.
That's different. That's sharing their enthusiasm. But boy, we still have a ruthless vanguard of people who really want to tell everybody else what they should do, how they should do it, how they should listen. And that doesn't work these days.
Right. I quite agree. I'd like to just steer us back a little bit to the question of watching music.
Yeah.
And maybe conclude on the sort of a larger question, which is experiencing music.
Mhm.
Because I think when we talk about music, we're talking about an experience, whether it is defined by an auditive experience or a more visceral experience, whether we're dancing to it or um, walking down the street with it in our iPods or watching it on a screen, sitting on a very comfortable couch or on a lumpy chair. I mean, all of that is part of that experience. And even going to the concert hall or to hear a live performance, if it's in a concert hall and you've been there 30 times, it may all kind of run together in your memory after a certain amount of time. But
Mhm.
if you hear a particular concert in an art gallery or in a loft or in a barn or outdoors, it may have the particularity of that experience, including the entire environment. And I've noticed a lot of musicians and even presenters trying to find the perfect place, the perfect context to create the experience, not just the listening, but the lived experience for their audiences. And in some cases, seeing that sense of the entirety of the experience communicated through the visual filming or the
Right.
creation of the visual document.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I think venue makes a big difference. I think there are ways of, putting concerts in different locations. Um, Thinking of the Crypt concerts in New York City. Um, you know,
Or
and
concerts on the mountain in Montreal, or
exactly. It's I think it's possible. I mean, I remember seeing this. It's a video. It's a. I don't know if it's the Rotterdam Philharmonic. It's one of the Dutch orchestras playing Beethoven's Ninth outdoors. It's like there's a roof over them, but it's obviously outdoors, and people are coming and going, and then as it gets going, more and more coming and staying. But it's not a quiet audience. They're obviously listening to and reacting and waving their arms. And when you get to the last movement, it was like a rock concert.
yeah.
It was really like a rock concert. And, you know, I think at one point the conductor kind of tried to get the audience to be quiet, but then he realized, no, this is them being engaged with the music. And it's a fantastic video to watch. And, you know, is it the same experience as listening to, Beethoven's Ninth at Carnegie Hall or, wherever? No, it's not. But it was sure fun to watch.
Well, also I'm thinking, one of the things that I observed during COVID was the group Collective Nine in Montreal,
Mhm.
who had already the idea that they were going to do films of their programs, um, programs that were developed conceptually with a thematic
Mhm.
idea, which was not narrative in the sense that it wasn't to tell a story, but it was to explore an idea or a state of mind or something,
Yep.
and created three films, which almost it was almost good fortune that these were developed during COVID, so people were actually paying attention to what was happening on the in music and screen
Mhm.
events, and these really were conceived as films, and the collaboration between the musicians and the artistic leadership of the ensemble and the filmmaker and the sound recording engineer
Mhm.
were really it was the discovery of an art form which worked best on screen.
Yep.
These same programs did not have the same impact, even with some of the same elements, including a dancer or certain lighting elements or certain set drapery. The impact was not the same in a live event as
Yep.
it as a film event. So it really, um, for me, it established that kind of artistic discovery of a collaboration and an, a separate art form, really, film music or um,
Yep.
not, yeah. I mean, something
But
which,
it's like the videos that, I mean, it started with pop music, with rock music, but those short videos were not, none of them were thought of as something they put on stage. The video was its own thing.
yeah,
And then, some of them, I mean, if you go back to the 80s, I mean, some of them, they're wildly funny,
yes,
um, and creative. And it was kind of like a whole, mm, you know, a whole music genre had discovered this giant playpen, and they were going to do whatever they could imagine. And they did. So it's a thing, it's the same thing. The video, it's a different media, and this sounds like what you're describing, a collaboration between people that understood. This is not a concert thing. It's a media thing.
Yeah. And I'm fascinated by the VR, the virtual reality um, possibilities also that you
Yeah,
described as a live experience of digitized that digitizes reality in a
yeah.
sense. Um, there's one thing that really important thing that we haven't talked about, and we could talk about for another hour, but we won't. But I
Mhm.
think we need to talk about the the balance sheet financially on watching music, because clearly recording music with video is involves far more people and is far more expensive and than just doing than I say just doing audio recording, which is an art in itself and a huge investment in itself. But the video takes it to another level. Um, not just because you have to think about the visual elements of what's on stage or what's being filmed, but also because of the technology and the editing and the craft behind it, which is just more elaborate and involves both audio and visual. But so we know that it's going to cost more, and it's not clear always where that investment is going to come from, or how it can ever be made back. But
I don't have any smart answer for, the balance sheet question, but I will say that, the actual cost of doing video, for example, has dropped dramatically over the past 20 years, or doing audio. I mean, there was a time when CBC Radio wanted to record a concert, an orchestra concert. They would show up with this big truck,
right.
and they needed everything in the big truck in order to do it. Well, you know, most of that equipment has shrunk to, little boxes.
Right.
You'll need great microphones if you want to have great sound. And, I mean, iPhones or, mobile devices can now take pictures that are as good as some of those big. I mean, I'm not IMAX. That's not what I'm talking about. But you can certainly do good video, with much smaller, much more common equipment. Um, I think the real hurdle is kind of conceptual. You need people that understand the media. Not, I mean, I could take a video. I could take a video right now, and it would be boring, and nobody would want to watch it. And you know, um,
I
there'd be
believe.
no storyline, and there'd be no nothing. And lots of people can do that. So that the idea of how it comes together is kind of the next thing that has to develop. And you know, uh, the constant thing you were talking about is a perfect example. It sounds like it of they had people in key positions that actually understand or understood the media they're working in and the collaboration they're working in. So it's balance sheet. I don't know. I mean, I think we're probably heading for different kinds of models. I don't know what they are. Um,
I've noticed a lot of, not a lot, but some venues picking up almost on the Metropolitan Opera or the Berlin Symphony, the Berlin Philharmonic, pardon me, the Berlin Philharmonic model of just recording uh, for their audience or for an audience.
yep.
So, a concert hall in Iowa might say, you know what, we're just going to keep on. We have the equipment, it's in place. We know how to do this now. So we're going to just keep on recording whatever is passing on our stage, and people can tune in or get it on demand for a small fee. And it's just another way of enhancing the relationship between the music or the performance, the artist, and our audience. And it's an enrichment ultimately, that we make available to people, and they don't necessarily expect to make a lot of money from it, but it increases the cultural wealth in.
Right.
Oh,
You know who does this really, really well and has been doing this for a long time is the Detroit Symphony.
aha.
They have a very nice hall, but they've also taken the time and found, the money to set it up with really good multi cameras. They've got their own production booth in the building, but most of all, they've got real experience, and from what I understand, it helps. It reaches a lot of people in their community. It reaches people internationally, and it has not taken away from their actual audience. It may have helped it grow. Certainly during the pandemic, it was, you know, they were one of the groups that had everything set up and in place. So, um, and and they've been working at it for a while. So they're a good example because the know-how is there.
I had an experience with the Cincinnati Symphony doing a premiere of something, and it was exactly the same week of rehearsals and the same premiere date as another piece by the same composer in a different city, very far away. And it was impossible for the composer to be in both places. But because of time differences, she was able to be in one place for rehearsals, and in online to watch the rehearsals of the other piece, and to give notes to the assistant conductor, and to be able to have feedback with the musicians in the other space with the Cincinnati Symphony, and they were wonderful. And so I mean, it's not the same thing as being there, but it allowed the composer an input,
Right,
and be able to and it allowed the musicians to have her feedback.
right.
Uh, but the the leader at the administrative director at the Cincinnati Symphony said, "Well, we're all TV producers now," and I mean, and I think he
Oh, true.
understood that he was taking a new, going into a whole new um, exploration of what it means to run an orchestra. I mean, he had to figure out how he could use this technology both in the internal activity of the orchestra as with his composer, and also in relation to his public. And I think different organizations are developing a better idea of how that can work. Small's Jazz Club in Greenwich Village is another great example. They have been recording their concerts and broadcasting them live and having them available on demand for a fee for years. And it's a great archive of wonderful live, literally
Yeah,
live music. That experience that jazz is, where no two performances by the same musicians are the same. So it's an incredible collection that they have assembled over the years. Um, so I think we've learned some lessons from the past, and particularly from the heightened sense of alertness to this idea of recording the visual experience of
mhm,
music somehow during COVID, when there was just a black hole otherwise.
yeah,
Uh, and certainly there's a whole range of new technologies, VR, and maybe artificial intelligence, and ability to edit
yeah,
things in surreal ways. And I think the path to the future is really wide open, depending on people's creativity and audiences um, following up on what's available.
right.
Um, and where the investment for it all can come from. But as you say, the cost for doing a lot of this is greatly reduced. And where do we go from here, Raymond?
Yeah, I think cost is reduced. And I think we're in a period of transition. Obviously, we are collectively still getting used to discovering um, the potential, but the pitfalls of social media, for example. I think there's a kind of a parallel development that's going to happen in the performing arts. Um, you know, and you mentioned AI or robotics, which is just like this, you know, what who knows what we're going to see. It may make that movie Fifth Element. Remember with the opera scene in that,
I
which which
yeah.
is stunning. And when that first came out, I just thought, what in the world is this? That was somebody's imagination back then. Um, what's possible now? Who knows?
Yeah.
Some good, some bad, and probably some creative things that you and I can't even imagine. But somebody in the future will.
Raymond Bisha, thank you so much for your time, your thoughts. It's a world to discover and to keep on making. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.